stayed low, or like the prevalence, we call it, the number of animals affected within a population is low. There's some management strategies like through hunter harvest to manage that, and so I guess that's a success. There's very few examples where it's been eradicated or contained, but again, like the situation in New York State was kind of unique in that it was an isolated situation where the disease kind of crossed from a captive population into the wild, and they were ready to hit it hard, and it looks like they may have been able to stamp it out. But there's very few examples of that. So it really depends on like where it's found, what species, how much surveillance has been done in that area, and like, are there cases nearby or is it isolated? There's different types of management approaches to deal with those different kinds of situations. And yeah, so successes, I guess, in just learning more about the disease and the dynamics of the disease and how to manage it.
Now, I was in my several years of trying to understand CWD, they've, through testing, they've been able to identify the animals that seem most likely carriers. And I did read somewhere, and I don't know if it was one of your reports, that said a male mule deer seems to test positive more often than some of the others. Is there a reason for that?
Well, it really depends on the ecosystem. Like different ecosystems, we're seeing kind of different disease dynamics. So in Alberta, for example, it's definitely seems to be most prevalent in those adult male mule deer. And so in that ecosystem, that's the animal most likely to be infected. And so, their management strategies related to that. But in other ecosystems, like in the Northwest Montana, in the Libby area, it's mainly affecting white-tailed deer, both males and females. Older animals, they're not finding many young animals, but it's a very different ecosystem, and it's a different, the disease dynamics are totally different. On the East Coast, it's mainly been a white-tailed deer issue. There are some areas in the States where it's mainly affected elk, certain elk populations. So it really, it's different depending on the different ecosystem. And, what we're seeing happening in Alberta is not necessarily, how the disease is going to, behave in BC. Our landscape's very different, the ecosystem's very different, right? So, so your question specifically about the male mule deer, it depends on the ecosystem. And what we see, there has been some science that has indicated in those early introductions, in Alberta at least, that the ecology and the behavior of those adult male mule deer, that's where we see the high transmission rates in the kind of earlier stages of the disease. And that's why it's most present in the male mule deer, because they're the ones that are, passing it back and forth. But once there's a certain number of animals on the landscape that are shedding the, infectious agent into the environment, then the females start to pick it up, and you see it in other species. Once it's in the environment, then things are going to shift. But
I do know too, with my dialogue with you, as well as clay-based soils have been identified as I guess special interest, and that the prions seem to survive better in that type of environment.
Yeah, what actually happens with the clay-based soils, and this is really interesting, is the prions will actually bind to clay soil. And so what happens is, like, those prions will remain infectious and active for many, many years, we know, in any environment. But because they're binding to the clay soils at the surface, they stay on the surface, more available for animals to pick them up. Whereas in other soil types, you know, those prions will kind of just filter down because they're not binding to the soil. So they kind of filter down, and then they're not on the surface available to infect animals.
So it could be like a permeable concept. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So looking at that's again another, you know, really important piece of information that we've learned through the science, is that looking at soil type is actually a really important, you know, consideration in managing this disease, right? Because then you have a better understanding on how it's going to play out on the landscape, right?
I know you have lots to say, and I'm sure some of the other people here have questions too. Now, as a hunter and concerned citizen of BC,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the man-made scenarios other than game farms, or human-made scenarios other than game farms, that could really put a nail in our coffin in BC? Now, I've talked to you about baiting and winter feeding programs, which for lack of a better term, seems to congregate animals. If one animal was contaminated, would that really help it spread to other animals, or is there more things we should be concerned about, like cross-border transporting of contaminated body parts? And
Yeah, so we've definitely identified some of those risks of you know, different sources of bringing CWD into BC, and we do tend to focus a lot on the human-related activities that can increase risk, because we don't have as much control, I guess, over just like animal movement. So just take a step back. So there's a number of different ways the disease could enter BC. Probably the most significant factor in spread is through infected live animals. And we know this from what we've seen in other places. It wasn't so much an issue for BC 5 or 10 years ago, but now that we have cases right on the border, both on the Alberta side and the Montana side, we're well within natural animal, the range of natural animal movement. So that's a big concern. But beyond that, it could also come in via like a human activity. So one potential source is through an infected carcass. So if a BC hunter goes to Alberta or a place that's affected with CWD and brings back, you know, the carcass or even parts of that carcass, that could be importing the disease into the province. And we know that any part of the carcass, it's bone or the meat, anything can contain those prions. And if they make their way into the environment, then it could be here, and it could be introduced anywhere in BC in that way. We've had a number of cases just this last year where we had hunters come back from Alberta with intact carcasses, which is you know, it's not allowed. We have a regulation in place to prohibit that, but it still happens. And we had a number of cases on Vancouver Island with hunters coming back with intact deer, and in the Caribou and in the Thompson. And so that's a big jump, right? And these are areas that we're not really doing a lot of surveillance, right? So that's a big risk, that not only could it be brought into the province, but it could be transported anywhere. And if any of that material gets into the environment, then it's here, and it's likely here to stay. So that's why we encourage hunters to, certainly the regulation that's in place right now is targeting the highest risk tissues, which are, you know, the organs and the brain, that we know contain the highest concentration of these prions. So hunters are supposed to kind of process the carcasses and just come back with basically, you know, the cleaned antlers and skull plate, cleaned hide, and then the meat. and we're actually trying to, we're proposing to amend that regulation to actually tighten it up a little bit more and limit all parts. And so only the deboned meat is permitted to come in, because what we're trying to target there, the intention is to limit any material at all that ends up in the environment. So if a hunter brings back quarters right now, for example, which is allowed, then they're going to process that material, and then you're going to end up with bones and bits and pieces that could get into the environment. So that's risky. Beyond the carcasses, of course, we know that prions can be present in other materials like hay, different feed like grain or seeds. And if they're coming from an area that's affected with CWD, like Southern Alberta, that could bring the prions into BC. We don't have a really good handle of how much that's happening. And I'm trying to work with our colleagues in Alberta and different places to try and track that, but it's been a bit of a challenge. So I'm working with the stakeholders on this side on our range program on when, how often are we importing hay and where is it coming from, and just trying to increase awareness around that potential risk. Other products like scents that are made from cervid biological material, like urine-based scents, can contain prions. So we have a regulation in place right now that the use of those products is prohibited. But we know that they're still sold in stores in BC, and it's still, the use is kind of a tricky thing to enforce. So we're trying to just increase awareness of that as well, and hopefully also tighten up that regulation to try and prohibit the sale of those materials in BC. Really encouraging like the synthetic material instead that wouldn't include the prions. So focusing in on those kind of risky human activities, importing the carcasses or different material. If those materials do come in, understanding like proper handling and disposal. So if you do have bits and pieces, encouraging people to take it to a landfill or like, bury it so that it doesn't just go into the environment. It's not available for other animals to pick it up. If there's baiting or feeding activities, those will increase, aggregation of animals. And anytime we have aggregation of animals, whether it's unnatural or natural, we know that we're going to see increased disease transmission. And increase, if an infected animal is in that group and they're visiting a feeding site regularly, then there's going to be an increase of the infectious prions shed into the environment at that site. So it kind of increases transmission rates two ways, because you have animal direct contact with animals passing the disease, but then you also have, healthy animals exposed to prions in the environment or on the food itself, because, those prions will get onto the feed, or, whether it's salt block or plant material, the saliva is their infected animal saliva will contain those prions, and it could be passed on to other animals that way. So yeah, those are the kind of risky human related activities that we really try and focus on. Increasing awareness is, I think, the most important. And then, as much as we can do through regulations, that's what we're trying to do.
Is there concern over common salt blocks? Ranchers will go and place salt blocks in the wilderness for their cattle, and obviously deer, elk, and moose love to visit these sites. So that would be another one.
Yeah, there's definitely concern. Again, anything that attracts animals in and increases that, like a concentration of animal or an aggregation of animals at a point source, then that has a potential to increase the transmission of disease. There's, of course, there's a scale where, the more salt blocks and the larger the salt blocks or the baiting sites, the more animals that visit them, the higher the risk, right? But I think there's a risk associated with all of those activities at any scale.
I do know this year, with the drought, it looks like we're importing way more hay from the prairies than we normally would as well. So I'm sure
Yeah.
that'd be a concern, but
Oh yeah, and with the fires, especially, we saw a huge uptick in hay imports after the 2017 big forest fires, just needing to bring in food for the livestock. And I get that. That was, it has to be done. And so we're just, as much as we can work with those stakeholders on understanding the risk, so that when you're sourcing that hay, to do your best to source it from an area that's not affected with CWD. But for sure, there's got to be a balance, and I think if people are aware of the risk, nobody wants to bring CWD into the province, and so if they're aware and they have options, and they can make those informed decisions around where that hay is coming from.
I think I have one last one before I'm being greedy here. I'm really sorry. I do know for decades they have been supplementing elk in these kootenays with winter feeding programs. It's been very, very successful. And now in the research that I've done as well is looking at sheep farmers. They do know and understand not to feed your sheep on the ground. If you do feed your livestock on the ground, is to move your feeding to different areas, so they're not, continually going to the exact same spot. I do know some of the people in these kootenays are very upset over the controversy of them helping animals through the winter, and I know they do it with the best of intentions. Is there ways that they can continue to supplement the wildlife that are in need of it in a bad winter, and reduce the risk of CWD? And I know it's a really touchy one, and I can see both sides of the story. And when I mentioned, supporting a wildlife feeding program, the feedback immediately is, oh, CWD, and I totally get it. Has there been efforts to help that program over there to understand the risk and mitigate the risks?
Yeah, we've been having a lot of conversations recently with the regional biologists, actually, myself and my supervisor, who's the provincial wildlife veterinarian. We're just trying to, from our perspective, we understand the risk associated with the disease and disease transmission, but we don't have a great familiarity with these practices and how they're applied and how many animals are coming in, what the timing of them. And so we're trying to learn more about those so that we can advise on different approaches. But kind of the bottom line after having those conversations is you can't get around the fact that there is a risk, that these activities, no matter how you slice it, there's an increased risk. And hopefully we don't have CWD in the kootenays currently, but once it shows up, then that potential risk really grows exponentially. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely, like I said, with different applications of the size of the feed area, moving it around. Of course, there's different ways that you could reduce the risk or reduce the number of animals, but in any situation, there's going to be an increased risk of disease transmission. And we know from other places, they've done a lot of work in Saskatchewan, like research in Saskatchewan, that has clearly demonstrated that when you have a point like feed source, that has a potential to become what we call a CWD hotspot. And the environmental contamination and those prions in the environment is really the scariest part. If it was just a matter of sick animals passing it to healthy animals, that's a lot easier to manage. But once those prions are in the environment, there's no way to clean that up. They are there forever. And that's the really scary part about these kind of food-related attractants.
And has the deer, elk, and moose farms, that industry, has it cleaned up its act? I know when you, if you go up to where Evan lives, you only have to drive an hour and you're in Alberta and you're into elk farms.
Yeah.
That scary to me when I saw how close they were to BC, and I know the history of that industry as being the real culprit behind CWD in Canada.
Well, that's one reason why that, like, the Peace region, even though we don't have the cases in the wild populations so close to that border, but we've identified the Peace region as high risk because of the proximity of those farms. So yeah, the farm situation's been interesting. Obviously, it was first introduced to Canada through game farms, and it moved around, you know, Canada and the US quite a bit through the movement of animals to different farms before that industry really had a handle of CWD. But once they kind of recognized what was going on, you know, there's some very strict rules in place, and looking at the Canada situation in Saskatchewan and Alberta anyway, I'm more familiar with that. You know, they really crack down on moving animals and testing. They had the herd certification program, and things were looking pretty good. In Alberta, once it and Saskatchewan, I should say, in both cases, once it crosses over into the wild populations, like the majority of the spread in Alberta in the last 10 years has been through wild populations. And, you know, in that kind of southern part of the province, they're not associated with farms. That's just wild, free-ranging cervids, mainly mule deer, spreading the disease and tracking westward. But so coming back to the farms, they had a pretty good handle on locking down the movement of animals, and things quieted down. But now what they're seeing on the farms in Alberta and Saskatchewan in the last 2 years is a real uptick in the number of farms that are infected again. They had just, you know, 1 or 2 farms might be impacted over the last 10 years. In the last 2 years, I think last year, like 10 or 12 new farms tested positive for CWD. And what they're realizing is it's not about moving animals around, it's about moving the hay. And so they have healthy animals, and they're introducing contaminated hay to these properties. They think, I mean, they haven't been able to prove that because we don't have a way to test hay and like different environmental surfaces for prions. We don't have a way to test that. But through process of elimination, it's not the movement of animals. The only thing they can figure is that they've brought contaminated hay onto these properties, and the animals have picked it up. So this is kind of a new challenge for the farms now, with the movement of hay, and this, you know, we work with the CFIA and agriculture in those places and here, and you know, they're trying to confirm that that's what's going on, but it's been tricky. So we have this new issue now with the farms, and all of a sudden, increased number of farms being detected or testing positive. So yeah, it's still a concern. Oh, Robin,
I feed livestock. Muted.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry, I think you're muted.
I'm feeding livestock Alberta hay, and and it has, you know, we've been bringing it in for a long time. I have mule deer in my backyard.
Yeah.
And it just is not something that it ever occurred to us, or that we had any idea that it could come in that manner. So yeah, I don't even know how to start tackling that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I guess the one thing we could do is just look at areas, especially in Alberta. They're doing incredible surveillance there. We have a really good understanding of where the disease is and where it isn't. And so we can use that information if it's possible to access hay from areas that are not affected by CWD, if that's an option. That's something that you could consider.
certainly needs to be, you know, we could certainly develop some education around that and just start to share it throughout the, you know, the farming communities and ranchers and stuff like that. We
Yeah.
source our hay from a hay dealer in Karameas that feeds, you know, thousands of head of cattle. And we've been doing that through them for a number of years. And, you know, it's not something that I think that we've ever had a conversation with, although I know they're hunters too. So, you know, it would certainly be an interesting connection to make. And then, yeah, so, wow.
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity there to develop some new messaging and outreach for the ranching community. A lot of our focus has been, you know, directed at hunters, and we work a lot with the hunting community, and like you say, there's overlap. But specifically, I think the ranching community, I think there's a huge opportunity to develop some messaging and partner with them.
I agree, because I've got chunks of clay in some of my hay bales.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
yikes,
Yeah. It's
right?
a bit of a red flag. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So interesting.
Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, it's good to know. It's good for us to know what's happening.
We bring in, you know, those big 1,100-pound square bales, and typically that's a northern BC and an Alberta way of baling, right, to feed those larger livestock farms and that sort of stuff. So, you know, those large square bales and large round bales in BC, you know, they're a lot more producing the smaller, you know, at least in interior and that sort of stuff. They'll produce the smaller bales, but
so
you know.
when you're dealing with your hay dealer, is there an opportunity to ask like where the hay is coming from?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, you know, it would just be us kind of connecting the dots of those CWD areas in Alberta, and then understanding what's coming in, and, you know, and just to develop some literature, I think, around that would be really meaningful, because, you know, they supply a lot of people. And I think that I feel fairly confident they would be very receptive to the education and the information and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kind of take a stab at that. We could do like a poster or like a little fact sheet or something.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll absolutely take a stab at that. And I don't know if this group would be willing to have a look at that and see if
there's, you know, it's definitely a great way. I mean, even just making a connection with you know, with the Cattlemen's Association and being able to provide them, and they can, you know, they of course can reach out, because a lot of these big producers are involved there and that sort of stuff. But, you know, social media can be a great way to share that information. I have a friend out at you know, has a big facility in Summerland, and, you know, they've just brought in 70 ton of round bales from Alberta. So, you know, like, and we do source a ton of hay out of Alberta as well. Alberta also is a major source of export of hay. So they're primarily, their first cut Timothy is all saved up for export, and you know, they compress those bales, stick them in shipping canisters, and so we're potentially shipping CWD to a lot of other countries. Like, wow, when you think about the interconnectivity there.
Well, after they detected CWD in Europe, in Norway, they, you know, they did kind of a epidemiological investigation to figure out where it came from, and it wasn't from animals, and that's what they determined. And so Norway, and I think maybe some of the other Scandinavian countries, they put a ban on importing hay from CWD affected areas in North America, because that was their kind of their top hypothesis of where it came from. So it's absolutely, yeah.
Well, and there are, there are ways to connect directly with the exporters. There are companies out there that just purchase the hay based on moisture content and stuff like that. And if it's suitable moisture content, they're buying up, big piles of first cut hay. And so, you could even potentially connect directly with an exporter.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm going to take a stab at that. We have the Cattlemen's Association is on our provincial CWD advisory committee. Yep. So I can, I'll loop them in as well and say that, we think this is important to get some messaging out to the ranching community specifically. So yeah, I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah, thank you. That's great, actually, because I love the mule deer in my backyard, and I'm a little in shock. So
there you go. Yeah. Okay.
Has there been any talk of legislation like the same as those Scandinavian countries did until we know more? It seems like a pretty big risk to keep bringing this in while we study it rather than.
100%. Yeah. And
with humans and COVID, like we shut down a smaller risk than that.
Yeah. We have, so I have asked that question, and we don't have any authority because we operate under the Wildlife Act. So we don't have any authority under that. So it would be under one of the pieces of legislation within agriculture. And so it would involve us working with them to figure out, if there was an opportunity to create a regulation or something around that. And so we've just started those conversations to try and figure out which act it would fall under. But it would be pretty tricky. Basically what I learned from the chief vet officer with agriculture got back to me, and she said that they if CWD was detected in BC, then all of these kind of levers appear and they can shut down the import of hay, but not until CWD is actually detected, which is kind of backwards. And so we need to dig deeper and figure out what we could do proactively, right? I think that's a really, really important point. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have authority, so it would involve us convincing our partners in the other agencies that this is important and we need to do this. Yeah.
Is this something we can use our members to contact like MLAs to help put pressure on that to get the awareness out there, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would we spread that?
Yeah. And, if there's, however, I can support that in terms of, providing the information, like the fact sheets, if that's kind of what we can do to provide the information and kind of the background context. But yeah, if your members are able to reach out and knock on some doors, and that's helpful.
So you say right now it's not detectable on hay, so there's no way to detect.
Yeah, we don't have any practical field tool to detect these prions in any kind of environmental material like soils or plants, or even different parts of animals like meat. We have no way to test meat. So the only way we test it is like, how we test the animals through surveillance is they look for prions in the tonsils and lymph nodes and brainstem under a microscope. But looking for them, we don't have the tools right now to look for it in the environment, or other, like I said, meat or, hide. That has been confirmed that the prions can be present in all of those materials through research. So in a lab setting, they can do it. In a lab setting, they have amplification techniques. There's different amplification techniques that they can take a, part of that material, whether it's soil or a plant, and they they can detect really, really small amounts of the prions, but it's all done in the research setting right now. We don't have access to those tools currently, but that's the idea, is that they're trying to develop these tools for us, and there's a big push through like agriculture, or like cervid farming. Obviously, that whole industry wants these tools. They want to be able to test the plant material coming into the farms. They want to be able to test live animals, which we currently, we don't really have a reliable test for. So the agriculture and that farming industry is really pushing those advancements. And so hopefully at some point in the near future, we will have those tools, but we don't have access to them today.
So for an animal that gets sick and either dies or is eaten by a predator, can it pass through the predator? Yeah,
through research, they've demonstrated that certain scavengers have the ability to, if they consume an infected animal or parts of an infected animal, they will ingest those prions. They don't get infected themselves, but those prions will remain active through their digestive tract, and they come out the other end and they're still infectious. So they've confirmed that through research, not in the wild, but through research studies. They've confirmed that with crows and coyotes and swine, actually, all have the ability to ingest that material. They don't get infected, but they can pass it around. And then, of course, they're moving on the landscape, so they can introduce it to new areas.
Yeah, so by extension would include wolves and bears?
Probably, yeah. They haven't confirmed it in those species, but presumably, yes.
Because really, in this country up here, any animal that gets really sick and weak or dies is eaten. It doesn't just rot away. Doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah. So that could absolutely happen.
So part of this, and I kind of looked at it a little bit last year because I'm a hunter, is simplifying the tissue sample process. So I think they were asking for whole heads to be brought in.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's a pain in the ass, especially if you're out in the bush. If you're on a farm or whatever and chop the head off and pack it in, fine.
Yeah.
But it's such a pain for somebody to have a freezer of that size to start freezing whole heads.
Totally. And up in your area too, I know that a lot of, like, the animals are bigger, where a lot of elk and moose are harvested, and that's, it's a lot of work to bring one of those heads.
Well, yeah, a couple hundred pounds of head.
Yeah.
So if there's anything that can be done to produce a wallet card on how to remove the tissue samples, would it probably increase your sampling size simply because of the logistics around it. And then the other one is working with the highways contractors, whether there's anybody in that, because probably as many animals die up here by vehicle, by bumper than by bullet. So
well, we've had great success. I'll just talk about the highway contractors first, and then I want to come back to the sampling. So in the piece, actually, our program coordinator, Brian Patterson, that works up out of Dawson Creek, he got an in with the Peace River Regional District last year, and they have been incredibly supportive. So last year was the first year we had a pilot kind of project with them to coordinate. So when the highways pick up samples, they have this notice system with our coordinator, and then we subcontracted a bunch of trappers, I think, as well, working with the highway crews to access those road-killed samples. And so we got a huge bump in the sample numbers because of that, which was fantastic. So we're going to do that again. So in that area, the Peace River Regional District have been hugely supportive. We're struggling to get the same kind of support in other areas. We've been trying to get it in with the highway crews in the Kootenays and other parts of the province, and it's been really challenging to figure out a system that's going to work for everybody. But we're pushing. We are pushing, because those road-killed samples are really important. A lot of jurisdictions that get a first detection are often in a roadkill animal, because if, you know, they might not look sick, but they'll just be, you know, a little bit off, and, you know, and they get hit by a car. And so that's a really, really important sample. And so accessing those are important. And we've had good luck with working with trappers, actually, because trappers pick up the roadkill for bait, and they're more than happy to submit ahead to us. And so we've got
I think that might be your key for the Kootenays, to go back to the trappers, especially if you talk to about, it's almost a competition up here between the trappers to get roadkill for their baits.
Yeah, it's the same in the Kootenays, which is another tricky thing. But we're hoping that we're actually trying to get in when they renew the contract for the highway crews, to get in there and you know, partner with them to kind of build it into their job description. That's my I'm optimistic that we'll be able to get some traction there.
Talk to your wildlife counterparts to see whether there's pressure to be put on in order to use roadkill for trapping bait, that they have to submit samples.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So coming back to the sampling, we've had lots of interest from hunters right across the province to learn how to collect the samples themselves, especially in the piece, because, you know, I hear that there's people are going farther into the bush and bigger heads. And we tried to do a little training session at the North Peace Rod and Gun Club a few years ago. But anyway, for whatever reason, we didn't have the samples available to process that day. But absolutely, I've got a plan, working with a kind of a film savvy person in the Kootenays, that we're going to do some videos this fall of sampling that we can post and share with people. I like the idea of a card that someone could keep for little kind of instructions on how to remove those tissues. I think it's totally possible, if hunters are totally capable of collecting these samples, if they just have a little, you know, direction. But yeah, if there's opportunities to set up a little training session, I could do a demonstration. I'm always open to that. Other places have had huge success in just getting hunters to collect those tissues and submit them. So yeah, I'm totally on board with that. Just need to kind of fine tune our materials that are available to hunters for that. And I also think some training sessions or like sampling demos would be a great idea.
Yeah, because I think it's still better to get 75% of the samples collected properly and throw the other 25 out that don't quite cut it, than it is to get nothing.
Yeah, and it's 100%. Yeah, and I do have some hunters in the Kootenays that are collecting their own samples, because they've come to our sampling sessions and had a little bit of training, and now they just do their own, and they'll collect the samples from their friends, and then they don't have to worry about keeping that head or submitting the whole head. They just submit the tissues frozen. So it's working out. Yeah, I think we could definitely expand on that.
So has it crossed over into moose yet?
Yeah, they've had actually Saskatchewan had a big uptick in moose cases this year. Not entirely sure why. There wasn't any cases in moose in Alberta, but they've had 2 or 3 so far. Over, like, you know, across North America, we see far fewer cases in moose, but you know, when it's established in a deer population and it's in the environment, then the moose can absolutely pick it up, and we're starting to see that in some places.
Okay.
Another outreach for us guys would be probably nobody sees more heads in a year brought to them than taxidermists.
Yeah.
And that would be another outreach for us, is if it's a matter of them learning how to collect samples. Is it's brain tissue, correct?
Well, no, not really, actually. With the deer, we collect a lymph node. There's several lymph nodes in the head, but we're targeting a specific lymph node at the back of the throat. And then we also collect the tonsil. And so that's all we want on the deer. It's a lymph node, 2 lymph nodes and 2 tonsils. On the moose and the elk, we collect the lymph node and then a part of the brainstem it's called the obex, and it's right at the base of the skull, and it's basically between that last vertebrae and the base of the skull is a little section of brainstem that we submit for moose and elk. So yeah, taxidermists again are totally capable of collecting those tissues, and we have worked with some taxidermists in the Peace region. I don't have a lot of our taxidermist contacts have either, retired or they don't have their businesses anymore. So I don't have a lot of taxidermist contacts currently. So if you guys know of anyone, if you could share those contacts with me, that would be really helpful, because they're a great, also a great source of sample, but also really important that they are aware of the program and the risks and all of those things, because they're handling these kind of higher risk materials.
There's really not another hunter-based industry in the province that stands to benefit the most from having healthy wildlife. So we can definitely help round up some taxidermists. I think that's pretty important.
That would be excellent. Yeah.
Which regions are you needing the most help? Is it which one's critical right now?
Well, certainly, the Kootenay region is our highest risk area based on the cases that are right up against the border. However, we have mandatory submission of harvested deer, in that area right now along the Montana border, and there's a new hunting license condition this year. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this. So for the last 2 years, we had mandatory submission of heads in the Kootenays in 7 specific management units, and that was under an emergency order from agriculture under their Animal Health Act. This year, it's switched over to us now, and it's now under the general hunting license. It's a condition of the hunting license now. So it's the impact to the hunter hasn't changed, but it's now just, being issued in-house, like through our branch, for the mandatory submission of deer, both deer species in those 7 management units along the BC Montana border. And then we're adding a management unit on the kind of BC Alberta border for mandatory. So long story short, the Kootenays is our highest risk area, but we're getting good samples from that area because of this mandatory submission. We need more roadkill from the Kootenays for sure, so that's always an area that we can improve on. The Peace region would be the next priority, because not as many cases in wildlife up in that area, but because of the farms right on the border, that's a risk. And I'd really like to see our sample numbers increase in the Peace region. I think we had, it was 166 samples from the Peace region last year, and I'd like that to be 300 to give us any sort of confidence in disease status. So that would be the big bump. As far as the rest of the province, like we have really low surveillance numbers or sample sizes from the Amanika, the caribou. We're not testing hardly any animals in those areas. The risk is lower, but like I was talking about with importing carcasses and things like that, and they could be transported anywhere. It would make me more comfortable if we were testing more animals in some of those areas. The problem is that we have limited resources, right? So we can't do it all. So we do need to kind of prioritize and focus our resources in the highest risk areas. So most of our energy has been in the Kootenays and the Peace region. But if there was ways to partner with the hunting community in some of these other regions, we could set up some freezers and just start to build that awareness and build some outreach, get a couple of freezers at convenient locations for hunters. Then if we can kind of share in the effort, then I would really, that would be awesome. That would be really awesome. And I would make every effort to make sure those samples were tested in a timely way so we can get the results back to the hunters. So does that,
I think between outreach with your taxidermists and with your local hunting stores, you know, things like that would be great places, you know, may or may not have room for freezer space specifically, but certainly they could be an initial contact to lead the person to where that goes to. So
absolutely.
you know, I certainly think that you know, if you want to help kind of guide us in where you want that outreach and how to roll it out, you know, we could certainly be a part of that for you for sure.
Amazing. Yeah, I think taxidermists, meat cutters, and the sporting goods stores are kind of three big targets. If there's a you know, run gun clubs too, obviously.
Yes.
But yeah, I agree with you that I think the first step is that outreach and building awareness of the disease and the risk, and that we have this program in place, and then kind of build on that.
Yep.
To set up freezers, you know, it's kind of the second phase.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems to me that you don't get the support that you need. I'm thinking back to the urine-based scents. Like selling beer at the liquor store and saying, but you're not allowed to drink it. So I just don't get why we sell something, but then we don't allow its use, but yet we're teasing everybody into using it. It blows my mind that we're a little bit behind on everything. So
yeah, it's tricky. We're, like I said, we're proposing to tighten up that regulation, and you know, I recognize that that's going to have an impact on the vendors that are selling this material, and it's going to have an impact on the hunters that are using it. And so we're just proposing it at this point, and we really want to get feedback on, you know, is this the right way to go? Are people supportive of this? Are vendors willing to switch? And to give some people a bit of time to kind of digest that and maybe make, you know, adjust. But if people understand that risk, I'm hopeful that, you know, they don't want to bring the disease to the province, and they would do what they can to help us in that effort. So
I don't believe any of the vendors up here carry it anymore. I think I haven't seen it on the shelves for about 3 years. It's all
that's
synthetic.
good.
It's all
that's
synthetic.
Really good. Yeah. We have great relationships, like with Backcountry and Corlane's and some of the other sporting goods stores. So, you know, they're totally on board, and they're aware of what's happening. I know, like, Cabela's on the island here, they don't sell the urine-based scents. Even online, they'll say if you're in BC, you can't buy this because, you know, the international store, right? They'll sell it in other places. But we know that, you know, Canadian Tire still sells it, and there's other places that are still selling those urine-based scents. So
Canadian Tire and Wally World, I think, are a couple of the bigger culprits. And next time I'm in one of those places, I'll be sure to look. But last time I was in Tire in Penticton and West Kelowna, they were still selling it.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it on the shelves here, but I'll have to check.
Okay.
I'll swing by for St. John's Canadian Tire after work tonight and hassle them if it is.
Right on.
I know when I submitted it last year, there was, I think they just stored it in the samples in a little paper sleeve or something, wasn't it? Are those are containers available to distribute if we get more meat cutters or taxidermists on board?
Yeah, absolutely. I can provide the supplies for that, for sure. We when we collect the samples, we put it in formalin, because that's what it needs to be. It's like a fixative. It's like formaldehyde, and that's how we send it to the lab. But it can be frozen beforehand, and then once we receive it, we can process it accordingly. So we can provide just little, I mean, a Ziploc bag, or I can provide little, you know, bags that we have in our lab to these places with, we've got like a 1-pager with images of instructions on how to sample. We can laminate those in these different spots. So yeah, we can provide any and all of that.
You could try, if you have a one pager, by putting it in little plastic bags and sending it around to the places that sell hunting licenses. So you get your bag that's labeled CWD sample with instructions in it.
Yeah.
And that jogs people's memories to stick it in their backpack or in
and
their
the
quad.
hunter can take it with them. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
Little kids.
Because I think it's
the education,
a lot of time it's when you're, you know, when you're busy gutting and it's raining out or it's getting to be dark, you forget about those things. But if you have that in your pack and you know it's not that hard when you got the animal opened up to do it, you can do it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, any of these things that we've talked about today that I can share with you. So we do have, you know, a number of different outreach materials like posters and things like that. We've got a rack card. We developed these kind of, we call them fact cards. They're just little blurbs that we don't have, like as government, we don't have our own social media, but they're kind of designed to post on social media for other people that have access to social media accounts. So I can share all of that with you guys if that's helpful, and I'd love your feedback on it to you know, hear if you think it's good messaging, if it's clear, if it would be useful for some of these things that we've talked about. And then if so, I'm happy to print and laminate a whole bunch of it and mail it out. But I can.
Well, I think you don't even need to, I think, to do that if you put them in the little collection bag.
Yeah, yeah.
So if it's just folded and put into a, like you say, a Ziploc bag, and it's all there, it's whatever.
Oh, the kits is an awesome idea. And I think because I've had a lot of interest from some of the rod and gun clubs, I can, you know, send little kits to the rod and gun clubs that they can hand out to their members. No, I do love that idea. That's really great.
If there's like a wallet card designed and developed by us, would it be possible to contact whoever's doing the printing for all deer licenses? Because a lot of it's mailed out, and that's all on paper that's waterproof. Like, could that just go out with a license?
I don't see why not. Yeah.
Have all the design for them. It's pretty easy just to be like carrying another tag with you.
Yeah, waterproof paper. Yeah,
Brilliant.
That's a great idea. With little instructions. Yeah, I don't currently have a an example of kind of a wallet size, you know, step by step, but that's something we could work on.
Yeah, definitely send us your materials and all of that kind of stuff. We're happy to have a review and provide feedback and do our part in sharing and that kind of stuff. And then, you know, I would just say, you know, as for how to roll out additional testing, you guide us where you need some support in that. You know, how we can help you develop that and, you know, and get some things to some places and in what stages you need that to happen. Because, you know, I think, you know, all of us have all been sitting back just waiting for this to come and feeling somewhat helpless to, you know, to change it. So it's definitely something that, that I think our group is very interested in.
Amazing.
We do have some muscle in Region 7, so in the piece specifically. So I think we can probably definitely work at helping out there.
Incredible. Thank you. Yeah, and I can connect you with our coordinator, our regional coordinator up there has been great, Brian. You know, he's a good local point of contact, but you know, I'm also here to support all of that. I hope to actually be able to travel up there this year. I haven't been able to for a bit, so that would be good to get back up there. Yeah.
Come up and collect your own sample.
Yeah. Yeah. This is so great. I really appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation with you guys. Lots of really good ideas, and I'm so grateful for your interest and support. So I hope we can just keep talking, and I'll send you some materials and kind of, you know, summarize sort of like where the need is greatest. And
well, and Cait, you know, you did a great webinar with BCWF and you know, but I, you know, I certainly would like to offer for us to do one with you as well. I just don't feel like there could be enough outreach in this kind of stuff. So, you know, as we get towards hunting season, and perhaps as some of these tools and sampling and things like that roll out, we could have some sampling spin on it as well, and you know, and do a little bit of education for people. So you know, I definitely would love that. I know, you know, we have a couple of taxidermists that have sponsored our organizations, and so, you know, hunting season is the perfect time to chatter with these guys and say, hey, let's do a little demo video with, you know, with them. It gives them a little bit of a boost. It gives the program a boost, and we can, you know, kind of get that. So there's some really great ways to network this that, you know, that give benefits in many different directions, right? So, you know, I definitely like to chat with you, you know, going forward, as especially as the training and sampling stuff comes out, that kind of gives the tools into the hunter's hands. You know, and then we record the webinars, much like BCWF does too, and have them available. But you know, we certainly have our hands on a number of really good taxidermists that we're in contact with, that I know.
Those contacts would be awesome. I would love that. And yeah, I'd be so happy to do a webinar with you guys. That would be great. I totally agree. Any and all opportunity to get information out there, to connect with your members, that would be awesome. And I know that, you know, that you guys are, some of you guys are based in the Okanagan. I'm going to be driving out to the Kootenays once a month starting in September. And so a stopover in the Okanagan on the way there or the way back, if there was an opportunity to do something like a demo or info session, that would be cool.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And yeah, there is a few of us here in the Okanagan, and you know, I kind of mentioned to you before, if you get to that point where testing in the Okanagan becomes you know, more of a priority for you, we're certainly you know, we certainly have the space for a freezer, and you know, and the skills to do some sampling and you know, the outreach. Peachland Sportsman Association is very active. So is the Kelowna Rod and Gun Club, and we're connected with both those groups, plus Summerland, and yeah. So the networking that we can do you know, towards that down here is really strong.
Awesome. We have we set up a few freezers at some of the clubs in the Okanagan last year. I'm just looking at my list here. We've got Kettle Valley, Kettle Wildlife Association. We've got something there. Osceola,
that's in Lake Country.
Right.
Great organization.
So, you know, it's starting to build, and I think just getting the awareness and the information out is just really going to help to support that. And
good.
The samples will come.
Excellent. Right on.
Cool.
Good.
Well, I'll follow up with an email just kind of summarizing a couple things, and I'll include some material. And then we'll keep talking. And if you guys have any other ideas or questions, or you know, some of these contacts, that I would love that, and then
we'll get you some contacts.
Amazing.
I had one last little question. There is a study in the Kootenays that's projected, or may have started already, on white-tailed deer movement. Is that connected in any way to predicting the arrival of CWD?
100%. Yeah, we're collaborating with some researchers at the UBC Okanagan and our regional bios, looking at, because we really don't know much about white-tailed deer movement. And so, like I said, the situation in the Libby, Montana area is mainly affecting white-tailed deer. So, I mean, there was other reasons to, you know, other objectives to that study to learn more about white-tailed deer movement, but we were a huge support of it because it's going to help to inform movement patterns and predict entry points. So same thing, white-tailed deer, mule deer, we're looking at that with these researchers to look at potential entry points of CWD from Alberta and Montana.
Excellent, thank you.
Mhm.
I
Cool.
got nothing more. I've exhausted my little brain. As
No,
always, I learned lots.
yeah,
One more time.
that's
What's the
awesome.
name of the peace area guy that was helping with organize all this?
So what was the question? Who's the?
Who is your the coordinator for the peace area for your CWD work?
His name's Brian Patterson.
Brian Patterson.
He's based out of Dawson Creek, and maybe when I respond to you guys, I can include his contact and our coordinator in the Kootenays contact, because they've been really, they're really great. I couldn't do it without them. They are just helping hugely with all of the on the ground stuff. So I'll include both of their contacts when I send you the email.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. Awesome. Okay.
Cool.
We will
Thank you,
focus on a
guys.
few things at our end too. And thanks for your time this morning, Cait. It's awesome.
Thank you very much. Just
You got
good
it.
to meet all of you guys
And
virtually.
you.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.